Hi, Diane. Thanks so much for spending a bit of time to help educate me and other people on what I think is a very important topic. And I guess we're both kind of working in the field of areas which have maybe been a little bit taboo in the past in terms
Hmm.
of people's ability to talk about it. But let me
Yeah.
just first of all give you a proper introduction. This is um, Diane Dancerbrink, who is the founder and director of Menopause Support here in the UK. I hope I've got that right.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. And yeah, and I think it's one of these subjects that it comes up so many times with the people who I work with.
Yeah.
A lot of women and men in kind of midlife
Yeah.
have to deal with this from different perspectives. And when people are trying to sort the drinking out, a lot of them are citing that going through a kind of a shift that the menopause brings can sort of, I guess, kind of start off a process of self
Hmm.
care, which maybe is not terribly great. So, um, I guess just let's keep this a free ranging conversation. But certainly, as a man, I feel completely. Um, I feel quite nervous of this subject, and I feel a bit scared
Okay.
about kind of
Okay.
what to say, what to not say. How do I support people? How do I help? But
Hmm.
maybe if I just kind of hold it over to you for a little bit to just maybe give your perspective, and I'll shut up for a moment.
That's fine. Thank you for inviting me. So I think it's really understandable that you say how you feel about it, because I think for a lot of people, they feel quite nervous around the subject of menopause. And I think often that's because none of us have ever been taught anything about it. So, sort of certainly none of the women that I've ever supported have ever been taught anything about it. More recently, I'm supporting more men who are trying to support generally their wives or their partners. They've never been taught anything about it. So, how can we have a normalized conversation when we've got something that lots of people don't understand? They don't really know what it means apart from hot flushes and no more periods. Um, and often people don't know how to get the right support for themselves, and they don't know how to support those around them either. So I think what you've described as your experience is really common. um, so do you want me to start with a bit of background about how I got into this work, or do you want me to just
I
crack straight on?
I think, yeah, just I think for people to kind of understand where you're coming from, I think it's going to be really
Okay.
valuable.
Okay, so where are we? 11 years ago, I had to have what's called a total hysterectomy, which is where I had my ovaries, my womb, my cervix, my fallopian tubes all removed at the same time. And I was 45 at the time. And I had to have that done because it was suspected that I had ovarian cancer. Um, I when somebody says that you have this suspected condition, you're sort of, okay, well, let's do the surgery. Unfortunately, what I didn't have any information about the fact that I was going to be plunged straight into a surgical menopause. So when you have both of your ovaries removed, you go into a surgical menopause. So essentially, that sort of cuts off access to the vast majority of your estrogen, progesterone, and part of your testosterone at the same time. So it's not a gradual transition into menopause. It's plunged straight into it. Nobody spoke to me about that prior to my surgery, and nobody spoke to me about that after my surgery. Um, so I ended up going away not really knowing anything other than I wasn't going to have periods anymore because I didn't have those bits, and I would probably have some hot flushes. I had no idea about the amount of symptoms that could come with menopause, and I'll cut it really short because it's a long story. But over a period of months, my mental health deteriorated drastically. I developed crushing anxiety, panic attacks. I became agoraphobic. I wouldn't leave the house. Um, I had terrible trouble with my emotions. I was very sad and I would cry a lot. I couldn't be left on my own for very long. My husband became really worried about my own mental health, and cutting a very, very long story short, it took me to a point where I was in crisis.
Yeah.
I came very close to taking my own life. And I was very fortunate to have a husband who acted in crisis and got
Mhm.
me the help and support that I needed. But at that point, I had no idea that it had anything to do with me being in surgical menopause, because I didn't know that there were psychological symptoms associated with having my ovaries removed.
And I guess, I mean, just listening to your story and how this came about there. I mean, you're also dealing with what is even by itself quite a horrendous diagnosis. The reason why you
Mm-hmm.
had this in the first place, you've got all that
Mm.
stuff playing on your mind. I mean, that can take you to a very dark place as well. And then you've
Yeah.
got all this to deal with on top of it.
Yeah, I mean, I was incredibly fortunate. The line that the gynecologist said to me was, "We removed your ovaries just in time." So
Okay.
I was very fortunate. But it also showed up that I'd been living for many, many years with very severe endometriosis. And I'd experienced 20 plus years of incredibly debilitating periods, a lot of abdominal pain, and I had essentially been fobbed off with, oh, well, it is what it is, on the occasions when I'd tried to address it. So, um, when I started to feel a little bit better, when I got the help and support that I needed, which for me included having hormone replacement therapy, um, as I started to feel better, I started to wonder, is it just me? Or has anybody else been really unfortunate? And I started to research, and I was horrified, absolutely horrified by what I found. People saying things like, I don't feel myself anymore. I don't know who I am anymore. I feel like I'm going mad. And I remember on one particular occasion turning to my husband and saying, if I ever feel like me again, I'm going to make damn sure I do something to change this. And that's really where menopause support and the associated national campaign to improve menopause care and support came from, is because I just didn't want anybody else ever to get to the point that I got to. Now, I think it's really important to say that my case was extreme. And for
Mm.
most people, they will never get to that point. But it's also fair to say that I have worked with people who have had really debilitating symptoms too. So it's menopause is a very different thing. So my experience was a surgical menopause.
Yeah.
For most people watching, they will experience a natural menopause.
Yeah.
So they will experience a time in their lives, probably in their late 30s, maybe into their early 40s, where their hormone levels start to fluctuate. And as those hormone levels start to fluctuate, for some, probably for 70+%, they will experience some symptoms. Now, for many people, those symptoms could be physical symptoms. They could be things like hot flushes, night sweats, heart palpitations, achy joints and muscles, etc. For others, it could be changes to memory and concentration. To others, it might be perhaps feeling a little bit more anxious, perhaps not feeling quite so confident. But there are around 34 agreed recognized symptoms
Wow.
of perimenopause. So, perimenopause is the first stage of the menopause transition. So, this is the time when the hormone levels start to fluctuate. You're probably still having periods, and perimenopause can last, for some people, months, but for other people, it can last several years.
Okay.
And then you have menopause. So, menopause is a clinical diagnosis, and that means when somebody has had 12 consecutive months without a period, and then everything after that is postmenopause. So that essentially means the years of our lives that we live after we've had those 12 consecutive months without a period.
Okay.
So that's a natural menopause. Then you can have a surgical menopause, which is like me, where you have your ovaries removed. You can have a medical menopause. So that might be that you're having some medication or some medical treatment, which has an effect on your ovaries, and that brings on menopause symptoms. And then you can have those who will experience menopause under the age of 40. So, under the age of 40 is called a premature menopause. So, at the moment in the UK, we have around 1 in 100 under 40 who experience a premature menopause, 1 in 1,000 under 30, and 1 in 10,000 under 20. So, the youngest woman that I've counselled through this is 17.
Good.
The youngest that we're aware of is 12. And that's incredibly rare. But just think about the amount of people that you have met in your life, or perhaps work in a big organization. And 1 in 100 under 40 is actually not that rare at all.
Yeah. And I can imagine that must be psychologically, for somebody who's younger, that must be psychologically devastating. I mean, if I put
Yeah.
myself, I lost my hair in my late teens and early 20s. And
Yeah.
and I can remember the impact that that had on me, which is, let's be clear, that's not clinical. It's kind of inconvenient, and um, it affects your kind of self identity. And I was like, my God,
Yes.
I've got old before my time, and all these things
Yeah.
that I used to kind of say to myself, and you know, and I guess when something is not, it doesn't fit with that traditional, oh well, you're getting a bit older, you're going through the change and all this kind of stuff.
Mm, yeah.
Um, it must be very hard for those people to, first of all, identify what the heck is going on, but
Yeah.
actually to, I would imagine probably there's, you go and see GPs and nurses, they're probably not, I don't know, I'm making an assumption here, but they're maybe not that kind of clued up in terms of how to deal with somebody who's of that kind of age.
Yeah, I think for premature menopause, it can be incredibly difficult because you've got young people who, some of them will probably never have heard the word. They certainly don't know what menopause is in terms of the experience. And you will have some of those very, very young women who perhaps their own mother has not even got to the stage where she is perimenopausal.
Yeah,
So you've got that first of all, then you've got the reason why they're experiencing premature menopause. So it could be because of something called premature ovarian insufficiency. So this is where the ovaries have stopped working as doctors would normally expect them to. So that's happened naturally. Equally, it could be because of medical treatment. It could be for other reasons. There are rarer reasons why that could happen. Um, then, if it is a medical reason, they have that to contend with too. So they have the diagnosis to contend with too. Then there is the issue around fertility. So, for a lot of young women, they won't even have got to the stage in their lives where they have potentially considered fertility or what it means to them later in life. And I think the issue with being diagnosed can be a problem because of a lack of education for our healthcare professionals around this.
yeah,
That's not their fault, that's the
no,
fault of the education. Um, and also getting those individuals to the right specialists because those specialists are thin on the ground, essentially. So when we're talking particularly about those young women, we really have to think about not just the right medical support, but actually the right emotional support too.
sure. But I guess And I suppose we've got a couple of kind of, I suppose your scenario with the sort of the surgical menopause, we've got younger people.
Yeah.
But I guess from what you're saying, probably the majority of people fit into that middle ground of
Yes.
kind of gradual onset of
Yes.
things. And I guess, doing what I do with alcohol addiction, that is something that
Mm.
kind of creeps up on you. It's like
Hmm.
nobody goes, oh, well, I think I might go and get myself addicted to alcohol today. It's something that kind of,
Yeah.
by the time you realize there's an issue, you're kind of almost past that point of no return.
Yeah.
Um, what should, I mean, you've talked about a few of the symptoms. I guess what should, um, people be looking out for? What does that kind of journey tend to look like? Because this is where I guess I start to find people, you know, they're starting to kind of, let's call it, self-medicate
Yes.
for things like anxiety, or just general escape as much as anything. And a lot of what
Yeah.
you're describing in terms of that kind of mental turmoil that starts to go with
Mm.
it. To reach for an off switch, society kind of tells
Yes.
us, well, you can find that in a bottle or a can
Hmm.
or whatever. um, what does that kind of, that journey tend to look like? What are people looking out for? And
Yeah.
and and I suppose my second part of the question is kind of, what else can they do other
Yeah.
than which is
Yeah.
the kind of the very cruel trap that alcohol lays.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, sort of, you're absolutely right. Your experience you're not alone in your experience of supporting those individuals. I think many of us in the menopause space have had experience of supporting individuals who have turned to something to help to support them through a time in their lives that they don't understand.
Yeah,
And I think, sort of fundamentally for me, education is absolutely the key. So having education for everybody, not just women, having education for everybody so that we all understand it, and making sure that those who are going to experience it, so every female essentially, those who are going to experience it have that information prior to menopause coming along. Now, the world is not ideal and we're not currently in that situation.
mm,
I hope that in 10, 20 years' time we will be. But I think the key things for people to remember. So obviously it depends on the age of somebody that's watching this, but I think if let's say you've got somebody who's in their mid to late 30s, they're going to experience a natural menopause. Well, be aware that perimenopause, for many people, those first symptoms will begin in your late 30s, early 40s.
mhm,
So, around, depends on what survey you read, but most of them concur that around a quarter of women will have no symptoms whatsoever.
okay,
We don't know, we don't have the research to tell us why that happens. I have a theory, but it's certainly not proven. And my theory is that those individuals are probably less brain sensitive to the changing hormone levels. So some people are much more sensitive to those hormone levels changing, even on a monthly basis. So you'll often hear people say, that they experience dreadful PMT or PMS. Um, that's a cyclical thing, and that happens as a result of the monthly changes of those
yeah,
hormones. So where your estrogen and progesterone levels are changing, that's why you're experiencing PMS and PMT. Out of interest, for anybody who has a really challenging time, and I mean to the point where perhaps you can't get out of bed, or you're finding it difficult to, you know, run your daily life in those 7 to 10 days before the period, that's a condition called PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And that's a condition that those individuals who have a very, very high sensitivity to those changing hormone levels on a monthly basis, they will, every 7 to 10 days before their period, they have a dreadful time.
yeah,
But once their period starts, they feel completely different. They feel
Okay.
absolutely fine again. Um, but yeah, around 75-80% will experience symptoms. So if you're somebody in your mid to late 30s and for no other reason in your life, you're starting to think, why am I feeling more anxious? Everything in my life is fine. Why do I feel flat? Why am I not experiencing the same joy in my life?
Yeah.
Why am I suddenly experiencing heart palpitations? Why are my joints more achy, etc., etc.?
Yeah.
I think anywhere from late 30s onwards, if there's no other medical reason why that's going on, so if you have no other diagnosis, and if there's no other reason in your life, so if nothing major has changed to make you feel any of those things, then I would be saying to those people, think perimenopause. It doesn't mean that your periods have to change. These symptoms can creep on slowly, but keep perimenopause in mind. And then as time goes on, if you think, do you know what, I heard this woman once say that perimenopause can begin in the late 30s, early 40s, then try and do some homework. There are lots of great resources out there now for people to be able to do their homework. We have, I know you'll put it in the show notes, but we
Yeah.
have a website called menopausesupport.co.uk.
Yeah. I'll stick those
We
down
have a
in the comments and
Yeah,
in the description
yeah.
of the video.
We have an information booklet on there now, which is a 44-page information booklet, which has been written with the help of 4 menopause specialist doctors. So, we know all our advice is absolutely correct. We have a symptom checker. So it lists those 30, 32, 34 symptoms.
Yeah.
So it's about getting away from the idea that menopause happens to women in their 50s, because actually perimenopause can happen a lot earlier. But I think the thing that I have found is when people don't have that as part of their awareness, they start to think, well, maybe I'll just have, my experience is I've worked with lots of people who've said, oh, I just have a glass of wine at the end of the day, and that kind of makes it feel a little bit better. And then that glass of wine turns into 2 glasses of wine, and it goes on.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, I want to caveat that by saying, obviously, there are lots of reasons other than menopause that people look to other things in their lives to support them. There are lots of reasons.
Sure.
I should be very aware of that. My background is in therapy. I've counseled a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, but as we're talking specifically about menopause, it's also fair to say that I have worked with and spoken with colleagues who have asked me for advice about their own clients who have started using alcohol, sort of as a soother for
Yeah.
what they're experiencing, which is actually related to their changing hormone levels.
Yeah.
So I think if you have that information up front and you think, hang on a minute, I know that probably traditionally people would think, oh, it couldn't possibly be, you're much too young. But actually, you're not. Late 30s, early 40s, it's not unusual for those first signs
Yeah.
of those hormone levels starting to fluctuate. That can happen then. If over a period of weeks and months, you're either gathering more symptoms or the symptoms that you have are starting to have more an effect on your quality of life, that's the time to seek some professional support.
Yeah.
Now, for most people, that first line of professional support will be their GP. Now, it's fair to say that some are better equipped to help than others.
Sure.
And again, this comes down to education, unfortunately. But if you do have a GP that can recognize what your symptoms are, they can offer you a range of support. So some of those things will be medical. So they can offer you treatments. So the, sort of what's called the first line treatment for menopause symptoms is HRT, otherwise known as hormone replacement therapy.
Yep.
Um, there are lots and lots of myths around hormone replacement therapy. I think it's really important to say that it always has to be individualized. So it's about the right product in the right dose for the right person. Somebody would usually have their initial prescription for 3 months. They would then have a review. You then need to be reviewed every 12 months if you're on hormone replacement therapy. For those people who can't have it or would choose not to have it, there are non hormonal options that the doctor can offer.
Okay.
Um, it's unlikely, unfortunately, in the current NHS landscape that you will have free access to what I would like to see, which would be to a therapist. Whether or not you have HRT, I would like to see anybody who is struggling have at least, sort of some sessions to be able to talk things through, because treatment can be great, but for some people, they need to talk through what's happening to them. They need to understand it more. They need to be with a menopause informed therapist who can, sort of help them through whatever it is they're experiencing in their lives. And I think the other thing that's really, it's not really recognized is that as particularly as people get to this sort of stage of their lives, where they're having these hormone fluctuations, it can mean that perhaps they're also starting to kind of reevaluate their life, because you're sort of, for most people, you're going to be maybe in your 40s.
Yep.
A lot of people are in a sandwich situation. So they're trying to hold down a job, they're trying to pay their bills. Some of them are still going to have children at home, others not, obviously. Some are going to be taking on responsibility for older parents, so they've now got extra caring responsibilities.
Yep.
So for some people, this can bring up a lot of stuff that maybe has been kind of swept under the carpet in the past.
Yeah.
Um, I've certainly worked with people who, have had um, adverse traumatic experiences earlier in their lives, and this hormonal fluctuation means that any of the any of the coping mechanisms that they've used in their lives, actually they're not finding them quite as successful as they might have been in the past,
Yeah.
because they're now dealing with another challenge. So I mean, there's no doubt about it, for a lot of people, hormone replacement therapy is very successful in helping to manage not just physical but also cognitive and psychological symptoms. There's no doubt about that. But as I say, for some people, it wouldn't be their first choice. For others, actually, they can't have it because they have a medical history that means that it's not the right thing for them. But I think it's really important that people know that there is help and support out there. It's not always easy to find
Yeah.
if you don't know what you're experiencing.
And I guess my experience, I mean, I've worked with the NHS a lot in
Yeah,
previous career, and you get into big kind of group practices. There quite often tends to be kind of one or two GPs that have
yeah,
specific interests in specific areas
yeah,
and feel particularly
yeah,
passionate about certain things. And I know in terms of my experience, when I was trying to seek help with my drinking, I felt very dismissed.
yes,
I said, look, I'm really struggling here. And somebody said, oh, well, and she was a lovely doctor, but she just said, well, if you're not drinking during the day, you're not an alcoholic. So basically there's nothing wrong with you. And I'm like, I'm here asking for help, and
Yeah.
that wasn't particularly helpful. And
Yeah.
I can imagine that, you may land it lucky and find, a doctor that's your doctor that is,
Yeah.
up to date on all the research and stuff like that. But if you don't, and you get somebody who's maybe a little unsympathetic or maybe a little bit dismissive, is it your experience that there quite often is like a lead GP in each practice, or do they need to kind of start to do their research, using organizations like menopause support to kind
Mm,
of say, no, actually, I'm not going to get fobbed off here. What I'm talking about is very real, and I want some
yeah.
help. And if you can't help me, then I'm going to insist that I get referred on to somebody that can help me. What would you kind of
Yeah.
advise? And what's your experience in that situation?
So interestingly, I was asked a similar question a few weeks ago, and interestingly, I did a quick poll of the group, the community group that we support. So we support a community group of around 34,000 women. And I asked the group, do you feel that there is a GP or practice nurse within your practice who can help you to manage menopause? A third said yes, and two-thirds said no.
Okay.
So I think we're in a better place than we were 10 years ago,
Yeah.
because with all of the noise that's been made around, we need improved care and support, we do definitely have more GPs who have done some continued professional development, specifically in menopause, but we've still got a very long way to go.
Yeah.
Our advice is always, if you're planning to go and see your GP, if you can, and I know not everybody can call their practice, I know so much has to be done online now, but if you can call your practice, ask to see or speak to either the GP or practice nurse who has a special interest in menopause, because in lots of practices, it's actually the practice nurse who has the
Okay.
special interest. So when I did my professional nurse training in menopause, it was all with practice nurses who work in GP practices.
Okay.
Now, that doesn't mean that there's one in every practice, but there is generally, not always, there is generally somebody in the practice who is more up to date around menopause. Um, I always say to people, if you're unlucky the first time, ask for a second opinion.
Yeah.
You've got every right to do that. If you're somebody who has a complex medical history, so if you're somebody who perhaps, sort of either you have a complex family medical history or a personal history, actually you should probably be seeing a menopause specialist. And we do have NHS menopause specialists. It's one of those things that many people are simply not aware even exist. There aren't enough of them.
Of
We
course.
need many more of them. But if you live somewhere in or around somewhere like London, Leeds, Manchester, one of the kind of central hubs,
Yeah.
you're probably much more likely to be able to see one. We do still have areas of the country where there is no specialist menopause provision whatsoever. In that case, people then have to be referred out of area, which is inconvenient and
Yeah.
costly because they've got to do the travel. But, I always say to people, kind of push for what you need. You shouldn't have to, but sometimes you do have to.
Hmm.
Um, it's unfortunate because the place that we've landed in now is that for many, many women, they feel that their only option is to seek private care. And that shouldn't be the case. Menopause is, it's not a disease, it's a stage of life.
Yeah.
And it's something that absolutely every medical health professional should have a grounding in. Anybody should be able to get care and support free at the point of need when they need it.
Sure.
But unfortunately, we're in a situation at the moment where we're still some way off of that, and that's a historical thing. That's due to a lack of education that goes back some decades now.
Sure. So I guess what I'm hearing is that you may land lucky. You may
Yeah.
be talking to that practice nurse, and I
Yeah.
think that's really good advice, because sometimes we forget about the role that actually. And my background in terms of working with the NHS, I used to work in respiratory medicine, and
Yeah.
the nurses were actually the custodian of the care,
Yeah.
and that kind of stuff. And it's very easy to just think, oh well, I've got to go and see my doctor. Um,
Mm.
but so while you're kind of navigating that, so you may land lucky, you may have to dig around a bit to find the person who can help you.
Yeah.
Whilst all this is going on, what can you do for yourself? One of
For
the questions
yourself.
I got asked when I said that we were doing this talk, and the interest was just berserk, was what kind of, what is the kind of the self help? What can I do to help
Yeah.
manage these symptoms? If I'm feeling like I need to go and just drown in a bottle of Chardonnay, what are the kind of the more healthy alternatives, I guess, to
Yeah.
symptom management and kind of looking after myself a wee bit better?
Yeah. So I think people find it quite odd when I use the word opportunity around menopause, and I think if somebody had said that to me at the worst of my symptoms, I can't imagine what I would have said to them. But sort of having navigated it and now helped lots of other people navigate it, I do genuinely believe that this time in life absolutely can be an opportunity, because I think for a lot of people, we live in a very fast world, don't we? We live in a very 24/7 world. You've got information coming at you all the time. So I think it is a great opportunity to pause. And I realize I'm not talking about, stopping working, going off and living on a
No.
tropical island for 6 months. I mean, every day having a bit of a pause to think about, okay, how am I looking after myself? So we're talking real fundamentals here. So, how am I nourishing myself? What am I feeding myself? Am I living on sugar and fizzy drinks? Am I starting my day with coffee? Am I navigating my day on coffee? Am I ending my day with alcohol? And in the middle, am I living on snacks? Okay, so that's not a good way to run the machine.
Yeah.
So, you know, everybody wants to have a treat, and this is not to say that people can't, kind of indulge in the things they enjoy in, but I think it's all about moderation. So, sort of think about, do I eat a healthy, balanced diet? So by a healthy, balanced diet, you know, not a nutritionist, not a dietitian, but very well aware that, sort of the Mediterranean style diet
Yeah.
is a great type of diet for us to be following. So, how am I nourishing myself is a really good question to ask. And, sort of looking at, what can I change? What could I improve? Could I improve my breakfast? Could I actually stop for lunch rather than eating it in front of my laptop? Um, could I actually sit down and eat a healthy, nutritious meal? Could I enjoy creating a healthy, nutritious meal in the evening? Um, do I drink too much caffeine? If I drink caffeine, could I maybe think about keeping my caffeine intake to the first part of the day so that I'm not experiencing the half life of caffeine, which could disrupt my sleep if I
Yeah.
have it after about 2 o'clock in the afternoon? Um, so I think the first thing is nutrition. The second thing is movement. Am I moving my body? So I appreciate that not everybody can, of course. But for many people, sort of, do you make the time to include movement in your day? So, we're not necessarily talking about doing a 5K every day. What we're talking about is, do I get time, or do I make time
Yeah.
to get out into nature? Do I make time to, if you've got a dog, walk the dog in the morning? Do I make time to go for a jog if that's your thing? Do I make time to make myself my first drink of the day? And if you're lucky enough to have an outside space, do I walk outside, stand on the grass in my bare feet, connect with the ground, and ground myself first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
Do I have things that I love to do, but I've stopped engaging with because life is so fast? Have I stopped doing yoga? Have I stopped going to my Pilates class? Have I stopped doing my, I don't know, Tai Chi, Qigong, whatever it is that floats your boat?
Yeah.
Um, am I doing some movement? Because, I'm sure you've said this many times. Not only is it great for your physical health, but it's brilliant for your psychological, your emotional health too. So, nutrition and movement, first of all. How am I managing my stress levels? So we all live with a level of background stress. Once it gets over and above a certain height, that's when you're going to be something akin to, the fizzy pop can where you pull the lid off and it explodes.
Yeah.
Um, Managing background stress can be so simple. Um, the thing is, for a lot of people, they're living with their background stress just bubbling under because they feel that they don't have any time to manage it. But literally, really simple things, engaging with a breathing practice where you're literally breathing in for a count of one and out for a count of three for a minute. That will help to reduce your background stress.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because some of this stuff is not as hard as people think, and as you say, with movement and things like that, anybody can do, a few press ups or sit ups or stretching and things like that. You don't have, it doesn't have to be, going sweating in a spin class or
Yeah.
something like that. And I'm always shocked at sometimes when people have kind of, been down this road, they're
Mm.
almost seeking permission to look after themselves in a way.
Yeah.
And, the number of times when I'm talking to people and we're talking about happiness,
Mm.
and I ask the question, what makes you happy? And there's a bit of silence on the end of the phone and people going like, I'm not quite sure anymore. And then it's
Yeah.
like, well, in the past, what has made you, oh, well, I used to do this, I used to do that. And it's like, right, well, maybe you need to reach back into the past and
Mm.
actually take some of this stuff and make time for it and understand that it's a priority for you to, spend a little bit of replenishment, putting a smile on your face,
Yeah.
and doing that stuff that just lifts your heart a little bit. And some of this stuff doesn't necessarily have to be like a magic wand. It's like, oh, I did
No.
some yoga and I just felt amazing. But actually doing a little bit of it every day, as you say, it's with that kind of fizzy pop. What you're doing is you're just dropping the pressure. You're dropping the pressure. So
Yeah.
when life does get in the way and the can opens, there's not the explosion that
Yeah.
that comes. And
Yeah.
I think people
I,
sometimes need to just really understand the importance of that before bad stuff happens. And you end up having a real kind of, as you say, a crisis.
I think it's also about, I think it's also about keeping it small, sort of implementing micro changes
Yeah,
because I think the other thing, I mean, this is a whole different conversation, but, sort of, I think that the pressure that people are under to, um, to go faster, to be more, to, strive, strive, strive. It's like, sort of, it's not sustainable.
for sure.
And sort of, so I think for a lot of people, if you do a lot of engagement with things like social media, it will be, kind of change your life in 5 minutes, or this diet is the answer you've been looking for, or we all need to have a washboard stomach. And it's like, no, you don't. What you need to do is you need to find the things that make you happy. You need to find the things that give you joy.
Yeah,
And that's going to be so different for you to somebody else. And there's no time limit. You're not in a competition with anybody else. Take the pressure off. find what works for you, do one thing that you enjoy.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, nutrition, movement, finding the joy, helping to reduce the stress levels. And then there are some key sort of exacerbators of menopause symptoms.
Okay.
So, some of the key exacerbators of menopause symptoms are, so if we look at things like foods, so things like spicy food can exacerbate the hot flushes and night sweats,
Okay.
too much sugar, too much caffeine, too much alcohol.
Yep.
I mean, the long story short, regardless of menopause, is that alcohol and stress are hormone disruptors. That's that's the basically, and that doesn't matter where you are in your life,
Yeah.
whether you're male or female. Those two things can be hormone disruptors. So if you are somebody who's experiencing, those terrible hot flushes and night sweats, if you can think about, maybe reducing your sugar intake, not having so many spicy curries if that's something that you love.
Yeah.
Again, moderating. We don't want you to cut things out that you enjoy. Reducing your caffeine intake. Reducing, I mean, it's really easy to say reduce these things, kind of if somebody is, sort of is using them as a support, it's really easy for me to say, and I totally get that.
Yeah.
But if we're looking at, in a general sense, what are things people can do to help themselves? So looking at all of those areas, and then there are lots and lots of, there's a plethora of complementary and alternative options. The thing that I would say about all of them is there is very little independent research around any of them. So if it's a complementary treatment, basically my line is if it works for you, it works,
Yeah.
because not everything works for everybody. When it comes to the alternative treatments in terms of the kind of things that you buy over the counter, um, sort of just a couple of warnings. Some of those things interact with prescribed medication. So if you're on any prescribed medication, never start taking anything, at least until you've either checked with your GP or your pharmacist.
Sure.
There are some really popular herbal things. Lots of people will try things like sage, red clover, etc. They work for some. If you're having very, very mild symptoms, some people find that they work for them. Some people find that they work short term, and then their symptoms ramp up and they're not working anymore. And that's when they have to go and seek professional advice. But if somebody wants to go that way with helping to manage their symptoms, we have a national register of medical herbalists in the UK
Okay.
who are their medical practitioners who are also herbal experts. So again, unfortunately, that's a private consultation,
Yeah.
but that is something that people can look at. For those who have had things like an estrogen receptive cancer, um, some people find that things like acupuncture can be helpful.
Hmm.
Again, the research and data is very thin, but anecdotally, some people say it can help them.
Yeah.
But for me, I think it's all about having the information at the earliest possible stage
Yeah.
so that people can recognize their own symptoms, and then that helps them to make informed choices about how they choose to manage their menopause.
And I think that's probably one thing that's really struck me from this is actually you do think this is a 50 something issue, but what you're saying is it's kind of 10 years before that this is all really starting. Are there any kind of somebody asked me about supplements and things like that? I mean, I guess having a good balanced diet is its own kind of supplement in a way, but other things that people find they're deficient in around, stuff like vitamin D or whatever. I know it's a very dangerous kind of field to get into because everybody then
Mm,
starts going like, well, hang on a minute. What I'll do is I'll just take this and it'll make everything okay.
yeah,
And as
yeah.
you and I both know, people are sufficiently individual on this that it's It's not. And again, evidence is always shaky because, for example, with acupuncture, nobody's going to do a randomized clinical trial on whether acupuncture works because there's no money in it and it costs a lot of money
Yeah,
to run these trials. But
exactly.
a bit of kind of experimentation with
Yeah,
a bit of um, understanding around what you're kind of getting into, what to avoid and stuff. But
yeah.
are there any, is it worth kind of taking like a multivitamin or something like that just to make sure that you're not deficient in anything, or am I kind of barking up the wrong tree there?
No, so for most people, if you have a healthy, balanced diet and you don't have any issues with absorption, then you should be getting pretty much all of your sort of all of your vitamins, all of your minerals via your diet. However, the one that probably most of us living in the northern hemisphere are not getting is our vitamin D3.
Yeah,
So the current kind of government guidance is that everybody takes a vitamin D supplement in the winter months of the year. For many people, they take it the whole year round
yeah,
because it feels better for them. There are some people who find that they are deficient in certain vitamins and minerals, but I think it's always useful to have a blood test
yeah,
so that you know that you're deficient rather than just taking these things. I think it would be remiss of me not to say that the supplement market for menopause has absolutely exploded over the past few years.
yeah,
Um, the long and the short of it is, if there was one that was the miracle that they all say they are, that worked for everybody, everybody would be taking it. The
yeah,
truth is, there isn't one. It's marketing. That's not to say that some of those things might not work for some people.
yeah,
Um, but I've certainly counseled a lot of people who have spent a fortune on
yeah,
these
yeah.
things.
These things aren't cheap, are
Um,
they?
no, they're not. So I think again, it's about doing your homework. If you're going to look at supplements, try to buy the best quality that you can afford because some are definitely a lot better in their quality than others.
Hmm.
But there isn't anything that apart from vitamin D, which is not related to
Yeah.
menopause.
But I think your point
Sort of.
around the blood test is really well made, and I guess that's part of the initial diagnostic process anyway. If you're going and seeing a nurse or your doctor or whatever, I suppose it would probably all start with a blood test where they'd be looking for certain markers. Or
Well, you say
is that
that.
wishful thinking?
Uh, you say that. Well, actually, for those who are over the age of 45, the current national guidance is that they should not be having a blood test
Okay.
to diagnose perimenopause. And the reason for that, it's really sensible. The reason for that is because the hormone levels are basically doing this, they're all over the place.
Yeah.
If you take the blood test there, 24 hours later,
Yeah.
you could be down here. So, over the age of 45, if it is strictly about perimenopause, then a blood test shouldn't be run. Um, Under the age of 45 could be helpful.
Okay.
Under the age of 40, absolutely vital. Must have two
Okay.
blood tests 4 to 6 weeks apart. Um, but I think what happens with some people is, let's take, for instance, say a 43-year-old woman experiencing a range of symptoms goes to see an informed GP who offers her all the options. She chooses to start on a low dose of HRT. She trials that maybe for 6 or 9 months. Lots of things have improved, but she's still feeling maybe very fatigued. There are symptoms that she's still got that maybe HRT hasn't helped to manage. I think that is then a good point to say, okay, maybe we should do an investigatory blood test here to see if you're lacking in something or other, to
Yeah.
see if there's anything going on with your thyroid, etc., etc. So typically over the age of 45, if somebody's presenting specifically around perimenopause, they shouldn't have a blood test. But under the age of 45 can be very useful. Under the age of 40, absolutely vital that it's two blood tests 4 to 6 weeks apart.
Look, hey, I mean, thanks for that. I'm conscious I kind of put you on the spot there, but that's a pretty
Fine.
comprehensive um, answer with regards to that. Um, there were a couple other kind of questions that were kind of in my head based on conversations that I've had from people on that. Do things get better by themselves, or is this a kind of a, if you're starting to get symptoms and this is starting to affect your life, is that a sign that actually, okay, you need to take some action and this, or is it something that over time will just rectify itself anyway?
Hmm. So depends on the individual. So for some people, as I said, some people will have no symptoms at all and
Yeah.
they will go through the entire transition with no symptoms. For others, they will have mild symptoms and they will feel, well, I can manage these. I can manage these with lifestyle. I can manage with my nutrition, my movement, managing my stress, etc. For some, they will be, the symptoms will have a significant impact on their quality of life. And they will say, okay, I'm going to use some kind of management strategy. If all of those people did nothing, so if everybody did nothing,
Mm,
eventually what happens is that the hormone levels stop fluctuating, but they diminish. So they become incredibly low. So they kind of flatline once you go into postmenopause. Now, for a lot of people, their symptoms will resolve, but it's not fair to say that for everybody.
okay.
For some people, they will remain symptomatic ongoing. So, I've certainly spoken to women in their 70s and 80s who are still having, it's generally, I have to say, it's generally the physical symptoms that they're still experiencing.
Okay.
But it can be that there are some people, and then there's the symptoms that nobody ever wants to talk about because they're just far too embarrassing. So we're really trying to kind of smash that taboo of talking about the embarrassing stuff. And they're what clinicians would call genitourinary symptoms. So they're things like increased urinary frequency or urgency, repeated urinary tract infections, vulval and vaginal symptoms. So, for some people who've had no symptoms throughout the transition, they can get into their postmenopausal years and then find they start experiencing those symptoms because their estrogen level has depleted. So, it's really important to say that there is a range of treatments that they are generally prescribed over the counter, sorry, generally prescribed from your GP.
Yeah.
And they're not systemic hormone replacement therapy. They're just localized treatments. They're things like creams, gels, pessaries, tiny, tiny doses,
Yeah.
but can be very, very helpful. But I think, the thing that we haven't touched on is the long term health implications of menopause.
Yeah.
So we know that estrogen can have an effect on long term bone health and long term heart health. So we know that women over the age of 50 are much more likely to experience a fracture, a bone fracture, than a
Yeah.
man. We know that before the age of 60, heart disease is much more prevalent amongst males than it is females. But as females lose the vast majority of their estrogen and go into their postmenopausal years, those figures around coronary heart disease, they become almost parity between men and
Okay.
women.
Interesting.
So that's another reason why it's really important to focus on your lifestyle
Yeah.
because whether or not you choose to have hormone replacement therapy, the most important things that you can do for yourself are to looking after your long-term health, laying the foundations for your long-term health by making sure that your nutrition and your movement is absolutely the best it can be. And with movement, we're really talking about a mix of aerobic, weight weight bearing, and
Yeah.
strength training exercise. And again, that doesn't mean you have to do a session in the gym every day. It can be simple, very economical, cost effective things that you do at home.
Yeah. I mean, even just getting up and down out of a chair a few times, can work some of your big muscle groups. And I used to sell drugs in osteoporosis, and yeah, the
Mm-hmm.
weight bearing exercises can have a massive impact. And it was interesting,
Yeah,
actually, you mentioned, and I don't know if this comes across, but about carbonated drinks. I'd not realized the impact that has on bones as well. So if
the amount of
you're
sugar.
necking, well, even with the CO2 in it as well, if you're necking
Yeah,
6 cans of Diet Coke every day, thinking that you're kind of looking after your weight or whatever, it's actually having quite a detrimental effect on
terrible for your
your
bone health.
bones as well, which is not ideal.
And your gut health. Terrible for your
Yeah,
gut
yeah,
health
yeah,
as
yeah.
well.
All that
Yeah,
acid,
yeah.
um, and I guess it's one of these things. I think as a man, um,
Hmm.
it's a real kind of sort of smoke and mirrors thing with regards to this. It's hard to know
Yeah.
where to kind of get things, and also some of it is a little bit kind of scary, and
Hmm.
again, blokes, as some blokes, is kind of like, I just want to fix everything, I want to make everything okay. It's kind of like,
Yeah.
apart from educate yourself, and again, we'll put all these links in the
Mm.
description, in the comments below, but I know you say that you're counseling a lot of men to kind of help their partners through this, and things like that.
Mm.
What's the kind of general advice that you would give somebody like me, for example, who's trying to support their partner through all this, and maybe, I don't know, maybe feeling like they're walking on eggshells because you can see they're not happy, and you're kind of going, oh well, is it me, or whatever? Just
Yeah.
how do you find that kind of shows up with the people that you talk to?
Yeah, so there is a guide for partners that I've written, but I think a lot of it is about. I mean, you mentioned the key word, the education, educating yourself, but I think it's also about being patient, recognizing that you don't understand, but it's quite likely that your partner doesn't understand what's going on for her either.
Yeah,
So being patient, recognizing that this, this truly is a transition. Things can change. If you're feeling that you're being, I've spoken to a lot of men who say, I feel really isolated. I don't just feel isolated sort of because we're not talking anymore. I feel isolated because I feel, kind of, I feel kind of lost because we have no physical connection anymore.
yeah,
We don't, I'm even afraid to kind of go for a hug because I don't know what I'm going to, kind of what response I'm going to get. And I was writing about this recently, and I can't remember exactly how I put it, but I said, kind of, there were some days when I really wanted a hug. There were other days when it was like, don't even come close to me. And I said, imagine navigating that without knowing what the narrative was.
yeah,
I can see it now, but I couldn't see it at the time.
yeah,
So I think, kind of recognizing that your partner, may not know what they're experiencing, recognizing that she is trying to navigate this as well. I always say the most important thing here is trying to keep the lines of communication open. So, whether that's a little note, um, ideally, kind of trying to have the chat in the most open way, which could be something like, you know, you don't really seem yourself. Like, talk to me, tell me what's going on, rather than letting that freeze happen,
yeah,
rather than letting that gap open up. Um, I also think, sort of recognizing that you can't fix everything.
Mm.
This is not necessarily something that you can fix.
Yeah.
Your role is hopefully one of being supportive and learning together, because you know we can't always have the answers. And I think you're right. I have certainly spoken to and worked with a lot of men who have said to me, I just want to fix it. And it's like, okay, well, should we just drop that straight
Yeah.
away?
This is not about you, my friend. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I appreciate why you want to fix it. You don't want to see your loved one going through this.
Yeah.
I get it. But it's not as simple as that. So, like, take that pressure right off of yourself now and recognize that your role is a supporting role. And I also think one of the most important things that I learnt and have shared now with so many people is, sort of, so often in our lives, the people who are closest to us, as you say, they want to fix it and they want to do what they think we need without asking us,
Yeah.
what do you need? What do you need from me right now? And what the individual might need right now is go away and give me 5 minutes of peace.
Yeah.
It's not that I don't love you. It's not that I don't want you in my life anymore.
Yeah.
It's just I need 5 minutes to myself.
Yeah.
It could be really simple things. And one of the things that I think certainly a lot of the guys that I have spoken to have tried to do is they have tried to kind of entice their partners with, should we go out to this lovely restaurant? Let's go away for a weekend, let's go on. And it's like, that's the last thing that individual wants. What they really want is they want to be at home in their sweats, curled up on the sofa,
Yeah.
and they want to have the one person in their life who is their constant, who has always got their back. They want to be able to be silent with them. They want to be able to talk to them when they need to. I don't think it's easy in any way, shape, or form. I don't think it's an easy thing necessarily to navigate. And obviously, it depends on every personal relationship.
Yeah.
But I think recognize you can't fix it, recognize that probably what that person needs is they just need to know that you're there for them
Yeah.
all the time, and keep that line of communication. However you do it, don't allow that kind of, don't allow the gap
Yeah.
to become a chasm,
I think that's so.
because then it's really hard to close.
And also, as well, by asking the question, what do you need from me just now? It actually takes all the pressure off you rather than like, well, I've got to try this, I've got to try that, and I've got to work all this out and,
Yeah.
come up with the miracle that you're never going to find. Actually, just asking. And, the answer may be as simple. It'd be quite nice if you emptied the dishwasher once in a while,
Yep.
or, you hung the
Yep.
washing out and things like that. And
Yep.
sometimes, I remember it's when we had our kids and everybody comes around and it's, oh, I'll come and help you, and they want to play with the baby, and it's like, actually,
Mm,
what would be really nice is if you kind of went and just did a few of the chores around the house, so
yep.
whatever. And so sometimes to just, I think you're right, communication is so important, and
Yeah.
just to kind of understand it's not your problem to fix, and just ask the question, what do you need from me just now? And I suppose not be offended by the answer if it's not what you want.
Absolutely.
Well,
Absolutely. And I think the other thing, sort of the other side of that, is that whenever I'm working with somebody who's experiencing this personally, I will always say to them, remember, the people around you, they don't know how to navigate this either.
yeah.
So tell them what you need. And that might not be comfortable for you. You
Yeah.
might not be used to telling other people what you need. You might not be used to expressing needs, but this
Yeah.
is a really good time to start.
Yeah. No, it's really great. Diane, this has been amazing. Is there anything else that you want to kind of touch on before we conclude, because I'm conscious I've taken a lot of your time here, but this has been such an education for me, and I know that the people who are going to ultimately end up watching this are going to get a lot out of this. But is there anything else, that any kind of final closing remarks or anything that we've not touched on that you want to cover?
I think I think the only thing that I would want to say is that, I there was a time in my life where I thought that um, nothing was ever going to look bright and rosy again. I definitely didn't think that menopause was going to be an opportunity. Not in a million years did I expect to be, publicly speaking about this, running an organization for it, running a national campaign, getting menopause onto the curriculum in schools, etc., etc. I never imagined any of those things would happen. I just want to say, however you're feeling right now, please don't believe the negative narrative about this time of life. There is an awful lot of life to live post menopause, and it genuinely is a great opportunity for you to be able to reflect on all of the experience and wisdom that you bring with you, and then decide how you want to use that for the future, maybe to fulfill the goals and the ambitions, both personal and professional, maybe for you to follow new purpose and passion. I think it's really important that we recognize that, yes, this menopause transition can last several years, but actually, there is a huge amount of life to be lived post menopause.
Wow, what wonderful words! And can I just say, what a wonderful woman you are for But taking this, I think sometimes, the universe kind of places something in our heart in terms of a sense of
Yeah,
purpose and things like that. And
yeah,
sometimes those things are not that comfortable. And some people run away from it and some people run towards it. And I
yeah.
absolutely applaud everything that you're doing. And I'm so
Thank you.
grateful that you've carved me out a little bit of time today.
You're very
Um,
kind. Thank you very
Oh,
much.
hey, it's been wonderful and a real eye opener for me. So thank you. There'll be links in the description below, and just to say thanks for watching, and thank you again, Diane. It's been an absolute privilege.
My pleasure.